Wonderful. Thank you very much. And apologies for the slightly late start to our webinar. We were having a few typical technical issues to get us going, but we really appreciate all of you who have borne with us for the last 8 minutes to start what I hope is going to be potentially, you know, a quite challenging, but also a very vital webinar topic for us to address today. So the kind of genesis of this has kind of been born out of some conversations with a number of different work streams, the gender work stream, the menopause work stream. Monique King sadly is unable to join us for technical reasons, and also the mental health work stream, for which I am the co-lead. So we've had a number of conversations about working out how to address what is actually a very kind of ignored and kind of talked over topic, but really has the ability to affect so many people's lives. And we've got some incredibly brave people to join us to come and talk about experiences. We've really set this webinar up to try and help raise awareness of the existence of domestic violence. We're here to talk about how to help and create an environment that allows victims of domestic violence to disclose that they are having challenges, help us to signpost and to spot signs where people may be experiencing problems, and really just to, as always, create an inclusive enough environment to be able to kind of support our employees going forward. We have some wonderful speakers to join us today. Emma Armstrong is the CEO of a wonderful charity called I Choose Freedom. I will allow her to introduce herself in much more detail, but she's going to be leading this and because she has so much experience of supporting domestic violence victims throughout their experiences. We have a wonderful contribution from a very fantastic industry colleague is the right term that I wanted to kind of use there. Madeline Forrester is going to talk about some of her own personal experiences. And then we're going to talk between myself and Amit and Emma, we're going to try and address the topics of how employers can help create an environment around which is, you know, a clearly very challenging topic. But we want to try and kind of create some easy wins, I think, to kind of think that employees can take away and think about, because this is a topic, as I say, that really is rarely addressed. And I think, therefore, there are some kind of easy paths that can be gone down to kind of create some policies or create some structures that will allow people a little bit more freedom and flexibility and scope to be able to hopefully make progress out of really challenging relationships and therefore thrive and prosper in the workplace, which is kind of what we all want everyone to do. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Emma to lead us through the webinar. Thank you, Emma.
Thank you, Lindsay, and thank you everyone for bearing with us as well. Let's hope that the rest of the presentation goes better than we've started with the tech. So thank you for being here. It's great to have so many of you here with us today. We hope that by the end of the seminar, you will feel more equipped to recognise the possible signs of domestic abuse and to be aware of what to do in those situations. What we're discussing today is obviously a very emotive topic. This could be very distressing and upsetting for many of you. It might relate to things you've experienced yourself or things that family members, colleagues have gone through. So please, at any time, if you need to take a break and step away from the webinar, then please do. Self-care and looking after yourself is definitely the key and priority today. If at the end of the training or during the training you need to reach out for some support, if you can email Adriana or write to her separately in the chat, and then she will pick this up and we will signpost you together around getting you the best support. Next slide, please. So what do we know about domestic abuse? And why is there still such a taboo around it? As we know, so many people still don't talk about it, but we want to try to unpick today why and some of those stereotypes that are still in place. So one of the most common stereotypes around domestic abuse is people saying that it's not that common, or that it doesn't happen in the area, or it won't happen to people like them. But if you look at the shocking statistics in front of us, this shows just how prevalent it is. So the crime survey for England and Wales estimated that 2.1 million people aged 16 years and over, so that was broken down to 1.4 million women and 751,000 men, experienced domestic abuse in this year ending March 2023. And that's shocking, I'm sure you will agree. Looking further down at the graph here, you can see that the estimated victims, and then you can see how many reported it to the police, suspects referred and suspects charged. And that's a really shocking low number, which is one of the reasons why survivors don't go forward with the courts, because the criminal justice system doesn't currently support the issues that we have around domestic abuse. So next slide, please. So who can be affected by domestic abuse? As you can see on here, anyone can be. So it can affect women, it can affect men, and also the non-binary community. There is not a typical victim of domestic abuse, and anyone, so from all ages, sexual orientations, disabilities, ethnicities, races, backgrounds, cultures can be affected. You will hear today that we will talk a lot about how women are affected by domestic abuse. That is for a few reasons. Most of the survivors on our panel today are women, so we speak from our own experience, and a few of us are working directly with supporting women or have the majority of their experience in that field. But what we also know is that the facts, the figures, and supporting evidence, so historically and currently, show that domestic abuse is a gendered crime, which is usually from a man to a woman. That does not mean, though, that we don't recognise in any way that males and other genders cannot be victims. And the aim today is not to sit here saying that all men are bad, because that is not the case at all. So there are lots of outdated stereotypes on what a typical victim is, and it's often associated with lower class society or people with low self-esteem and people with unstable mental health issues. You might have heard previously in the past as well, people will say women are attracted to abusive men. So these are some of the stereotypes that we want to break down further today. So if we move to the next slide, we'll have a look at some of the statistics currently in the UK. So going from left to right, every year, over 2 million adults aged 16 to 59 in the UK suffer from some form of domestic abuse. Only 1 in 5 victims or partners call the police. On average, victims wait 3 years before getting the support they need, and this is increased to 1.5 times longer if they're from a Black or racially minoritised background. And that also includes British or Irish backgrounds. And we know from working in the field that I currently work in running refuges for survivors of domestic abuse, that on average, somebody takes 7 attempts before they leave that abusive relationship for good. 2 women a week are killed by a current or ex-partner in England and Wales. And on average, 30 men are murdered every year due to domestic violence. Next slide, please. So there are many people that have further barriers to accessing help, and they have multiple needs that are often hidden from services. So for example, disabled women are twice as likely to experience domestic abuse as a non-disabled woman. 32% of homeless women and domestic abuse said that domestic abuse contributed to their homelessness. Victims with mental health needs were more likely to have problems with drug and alcohol use, and we'll touch on mental health later in the seminar. Research shows that a woman facing domestic violence has to make 11 contacts with agencies before getting the help she needs. And again, this rises to 17 if she is from a Black or racially minoritised background. LGBTQ+ victims of domestic abuse are more than twice as likely to have self-harmed and also twice as likely to have attempted suicide. On average, older victims experience abuse for as long before accessing help as those under the age of 61, which I'm sure you will agree are shocking statistics. Next slide, please. So people often wrongly believe that there has to be physical violence in a relationship for it to be abusive. There may be violence, but that isn't always the case. And if you think about the language that we use, domestic abuse has and still is referred to as domestic violence, which also implies this. So that sets the tone that actually there has to be violence in that relationship for it to be abusive. Coercive controlling behaviour is a crime that basically only became an offence in 2015, so not actually that long ago. But I'm going to share with you now my own experiences of domestic abuse, and that will incorporate coercive controlling and behaviour. So I would like to start by apologising, as what I am about to talk about contains some very abusive swear words. I haven't changed them in any way, as all too often in domestic abuse situations, what victims are exposed to is minimised. I would never let someone treat me that way, said me aged 16 years. I would never stay in a relationship with somebody who hit me, said me aged 18 years. But I love him, said me aged 19 years. I first met my ex whilst at my mum's friend's barbecue. He had a girlfriend at the time, but he was happy to flirt with me, and I liked having his attention. Shortly after this, he added me on Facebook. We started exchanging messages, and he told me how his now ex-girlfriend had hit him and perforated his eardrum. I felt really sorry for him. How could she have hit him? Why? So we started texting more, and things moved very quickly, and soon we were classed as being together. Within weeks, I had noticed that his behaviour could be odd at times. I wouldn't hear from him from days on end, usually over a weekend. He was either his usual charming, confident self, or difficult to even get a conversation out of. It was like I was dating two different people. It was a Saturday night, and my best friend at the time had texted me to see if I wanted to meet up. He didn't like this, and he started shouting at me. I remember trying to calm him down and thinking, why was he acting this way? But it was her fault though, because she was a slag and he didn't want his girl getting that reputation too. I left his house in a hope that he would realise he was acting stupid. I was just about to drive off when he ran at my car and kicked the driver's side in. Freezing in shock, I couldn't move, and he just walked back into his house smiling. This is when I started to become really good at lying. I had to be. How could I tell my mum that it was him who had kicked my car in? She wouldn't like him anymore if she knew. So that was the first lie I told. My car was just parked down the side road and somebody must have just driven into it. My ex said he felt really bad for what he had done, and he was begging me for forgiveness, and I believed him. He admitted to being on drugs, and he told me how he had been exposed to cocaine at the age of 13 by his mum. He was addicted now, and I felt sorry for him. Having no experience of drugs, I had no idea what the signs were, but he swore he would never do it again. Things were okay for a few weeks. He was really trying to make an effort, sending me text messages about how much he loved me, how I was the best thing that ever happened to him, how he would be lost without me. And that's what every girl at the age of 20 wants to hear, that she is loved and special. Then the next argument would happen, and the next. I had annoyed him because a male friend had texted me. I hadn't texted him back quick enough, or I had worn something that he thought was too revealing. I had made plans to see a friend. I was spending time with my family. I was 10 minutes late to pick him up from the pub. I was clearly cheating on him. I was always doing something wrong. You're a bitch. You are a slag, and I will kill you if you talk to him again. It's always your fault. You are to blame. You make me angry. You wind me up. You are the reason I act this way. It's because I love you too much. Sorry, I shouldn't have said that. Sorry, I shouldn't have done that, became second language to me. In front of friends and family, my ex was always the cheeky chappy that everyone knew him to be, always the one that made everyone smile, and always the one that made everyone laugh. But behind closed doors, I continued to see a very different side to him. I began to not drink on nights out. I would always be the driver. I knew it wasn't safe to me to be drinking around him in case he kicked off and I had to get myself home. I mean nights out with him, as by now I barely had any friends left except those of his. They couldn't understand why I kept going back to him, and nor could I at the time. It was all so confusing. I knew that the only way to keep them safe was to keep him happy, and the best way to do that was to make everyone around me a distant memory. a fancy dress at the local pub, and I went along with him and his friends. Whilst outside in the smoking area, a guy very innocently asked me to take a photo of him and his friends. And I can still remember to this day the look on my ex's face when he walked out. That look only meant one thing. We left the party straight after this. In front of his friend walking home, all was fine. But when we got into bed, it wasn't. I was no longer laying on the mattress. It was on top of me and I'd been thrown out of the bed. This time his reaction was different. He told me that he wanted to die and it was my fault, that I had driven him to this. He was cutting himself because of me. It was my fault that his wrists were bleeding and there was blood splattered up the walls. Begging him to stop, he finally did. The next day, I was the love of his life, the best thing that had ever happened to him, his baby. He just got overwhelmed at times because he loved me so much, but he was sorry and it wouldn't happen again. 2:30 a.m. and my phone was ringing non-stop. I opened my eyes and it was him. The fact that I answered meant I was in the wrong. I was clearly shagging someone else. Demanding that I drove to pick him up, I got in the car filled with anxiety of not knowing what was coming next. But I'd obviously been with another man that night, which is why he was so angry, because it was all my fault, again, but then it always was. He was screaming at me that he was going to kill me because I was a slut. I deserved to die, he was saying, and he would show me what happens with him if I mess with him, and he did. He pulled the gear stick out of place and the car went crashing into the curb. I got out of the car at 3:15 a.m. in my pajamas on the side of a random road, sobbing and just pleading that he would just leave me alone. This time his reaction wasn't different. It was the same as before. It was my fault that he had taken an overdose. I was going to be responsible for him dying. The next day, I was the love of his life, the best thing that had ever happened to him, his baby. He just got overwhelmed at times because he loved me so much, but he was sorry and it wouldn't happen again. I would have been in the wrong that night if I didn't answer my phone too. This became a regular pattern within our relationship. He would abuse me, I would leave, and he would beg for forgiveness. He would attempt suicide. He would insist he would get clean off the cocaine and stop drinking. Only I could save him. That's what he told me, and I believed it. Every part of me, down to my core, believed that it was my job to save him. He would abuse me financially, stealing my money to fund his habits to get him out of debt. He would demand sex when he wanted it, and I would wake up to find him touching me, trying to get my clothes off. I would leave. He would attempt suicide. He would beg for forgiveness, and I feared that he would kill himself, so I returned to the relationship. My ex controlled me completely. He controlled how I felt. He controlled every aspect of my life, who I spoke to, who I was friends with, what I did, what I didn't do. He controlled me, and I lived in fear. I walked on eggshells, not knowing which version of him I would have from one day to the next. And I had become such an amazing liar. I had an excuse for everything that happened. I hid things from those closest to me. I convinced them and everyone around me that everything was fine. I covered up every bruise and every tear, and I wore a very fake smile. For me personally, the emotional abuse and the effects of it were far worse than the physical abuse. My bruises would heal, but my self-esteem was gone. My confidence was shattered, and I believed him when he said that nobody would ever love me or want me. I believed him when he said if I ever tried to move on, he would kill me. I believed him most when he said if I ever tried to leave him, that he would kill himself. The above is only a small amount of the abuse I was subjected to for over 5 years, but I knew I had to leave, as I couldn't take any more. I packed up my belongings from our flat and I had planned on leaving in the morning. He had gone on a binge and I knew that he wouldn't be home for days because that was his usual pattern. But this night was different. He came back at 4 a.m. with his friend and I was sleeping in bed. As I heard him come into the room, I saw him smashing my phone against the wall. This was the 8th phone that I'd had in that relationship. He grabbed me out of the bed and threw me on the floor, and I lay there screaming, with my head in my hands, cowering in front of the wardrobe. His friend heard my cries and came in and dragged him off me. He held him against the wall, and I ran and didn't look back. That was not the first time that I had feared for my life. My mum and sister woke up in the morning to find me shaking in the living room. My mum called the police, but I was too afraid of what he would do, so I refused to press charges. The police officer gave him a caution for domestic abuse and told him not to contact me directly or indirectly. A week later, my ex hung himself from our shower. He left a suicide letter which blamed me. His friends and family blamed me, and at the time, I blamed me. In the months, years following his death, I experienced further stalking and harassment from his family members and friends. This consisted of several death threats, vandalism of my property, and further abuse. So in a desperate attempt to feel safe again, I resorted to changing my number, changing my car, deleting all social media, moving to a new house away from my family, and changing jobs. 6 months after his death, I applied for a job at Refuge. At a time where I was still feeling the most intense pain I've ever felt in my life, I now had a reason to get up in the morning. And I started work here knowing that it would either make me or break me. And for years, every time I heard the word suicide, it would literally send shivers all over my body. But working here has played an enormous part in my journey to becoming a survivor and no longer feeling like I'm a victim. Every single person sitting here today can help to tackle domestic abuse. So let's put the blame back where it belongs with the perpetrator, not the survivor, and stop passing judgments such as why did they stay or why didn't you just leave? Unless you have ever been in an abusive relationship yourself, you will never understand the power that that person has over you and how paralyzing it is. But instead, ask yourself, what can you do to tackle domestic abuse? Thank you. So I wanted to share my story because I think there is so much that people still don't know around how controlling an abusive relationship can be. And I hope that that has brought to life the patterns that somebody may experience in the love bombing, the gaslighting, and how quickly things can change, and also how entwined it is. So thank you for that. If we could move on to the next slide, please, that would be great. So let's have a look at an overview of domestic abuse. And obviously what someone experiences in their relationship is very different for everybody else, and it's very unique. But what we do know is that there are some similarities that people face. And sadly, as I've said, so many people are judged for not leaving. And this was the situation with me. I lost all my friends because they just kept saying, if it's that bad, why wouldn't you just leave? But what people don't realise is at the point that someone leaves an abusive relationship, the risk heightens. So it actually becomes the most dangerous part of that time and that situation, because the perpetrator loses that control. So that is when the victim is most at risk of being murdered, when they leave, which is just one of the many reasons why it is so difficult for people to leave. So looking at what we can see in front of us, just a couple of things. I'm not going to read through them all, but there's a couple of points I wanted to pick up on from my working experience. So breaking trust, we often see this around children. So it's like breaking promises and shared agreements. So children will be used as almost bait in an abusive relationship, and a perpetrator will control their victim by saying, I'll have the children this day, and then they will do things like cancel those plans last minute, stop that victim maybe being able to go to work, taking the car keys so that they can't access going out and seeing people, so creating feelings of isolation. In terms of harassment and stalking, that is one of the red factors in domestic abuse, and it is one of our big red flags. So harassment and stalking are the biggest risk of homicides, and obviously we as a Refuge do everything we can to avoid domestic abuse homicides. But I think it's important to note that alongside strangulation are the red flags. In terms of risk, what I would say is that listen to your survivors, because they know their situation better than anyone else. So if they're saying to you, it is not safe for me to leave, now is not the time, I can't do this, respect that and listen to them, because they know it and they know how to manage their risk. They've kept themselves in a relationship and as safe as they can for as long as they have been in that relationship. So I'm not going to read over those because we we'll cover more kind of around the definitions and terms today. So next slide, please. So let's look at like what causes domestic abuse. And again, there are so many unhelpful stereotypes that still exist. Often you'll hear she provoked him, or it's caused by poor mental health. You know, that poor perpetrator had a really difficult time, you know, at work, and they were really struggling with their mental health. So they turned to alcohol, they turned to drugs, and, you know, all that does is takes away the onus from the perpetrator and puts the blame on that victim still that's stuck in that relationship. So we take away any responsibility that that perpetrator has, and they're wrong. All of those stereotypes are wrong. We know that domestic abuse is simply about power and control. And that's the power and control that somebody has to exert that on somebody else. And that's all it comes down to. So in front of us, you can see two power and control wheels, which are often used in the field of domestic abuse. And these look at some of the tactics that may be used. So you can see using coercion and threats, using intimidation. So somebody doesn't even need to physically intimidate you or have violence. They may just do things such as bang their hand on a table to tell you that they don't like what you're doing. Or it may be that they look at you in a funny way, and that's their warning to you to say, stop doing what you're doing. Using emotional abuse. Isolation is so common. So stopping people from seeing their friends, their family, stopping them from going to work, making them lose their jobs. And we'll touch later when we hear around Maddie's experiences around how working in the financial industry, this has caused difficulties for her. Minimizing and blaming the victim. So it's always their fault. You know, it's something they did. We often hear in our case, you know, she has poor mental health. You know, she's really unstable. She has post-traumatic stress. You know, it's from giving birth. You know, she's really struggled since that. And they put all of that blame back on the victim to take that onus away from themselves. Using the children, as we've touched on, economic abuse is rife currently. So we often have our survivors that come into refuge and they are in thousands of pounds of debt, you know, £30,000 of debt. And yet the victim in front of me can't speak English, doesn't even know that they have a bank account. And yet somebody has set everything up in their name, got them to sign it, unknown to them, telling them that they're signing something different. Often in our case, they'll say, you're signing papers for you to stay in the UK if immigration is being used against them. But actually what is happening is they've set up a company in somebody else's name, and then that victim is left with thousands of pounds of debt. So that is one we've seen recently that's really on the rise. Next slide, please. So looking at the characteristics of a coercive and controlling perpetrator, who is an abuser? Well, anyone can be an abuser. You know, it could be your postman, it could be your local police officer, it could be somebody you work with, it could be a family member. And these are some of the common characteristics that you may see. So you'll see controlling behaviour, quite possessive behaviour. So I had that myself with my ex calling me his girl. I was always his, like I was his property. And if we think back to even kind of old school around marriages, like when somebody gets married, the woman is given away. You know, she's not a piece of meat, she's not property, but yet she's been given away. Manipulative behaviour. Acting like they're the superior. So we often see this with children that come into our refuge that have learned in their cultures that males are superior to females. So we've had a 3-year-old that was urinating in his mum's handbag to get her to do what he wanted her to do. And because she wasn't doing it, he was torturing her that way. And he felt that at the age of 3, he was more important than her. And she believed it. So in a meeting where there was 2 chairs left, and I was sitting on one and she went to sit down, the 3-year-old said, up. He wanted to sit on that chair, and she got up and got off that chair. And the 3-year-old sat down thinking that he was the superior sex. Minimising and denying, as we've spoken about, and partner blaming. So often blaming everybody else but themselves. And the sense of entitlement. So thinking they are owed something. And using children as a part of abuse. We also see pets. So pets can often be used as a way of controlling somebody. So it may be that a pet is very dear to a survivor, and as a form of abuse, they will kick that pet, or they will harm that pet, or they will take away the means to pay for food for that pet. So we often see not only children, but pets being used in abusive situations. Next slide, please. So what are the effects of domestic abuse? So everyone presents differently. And these effects could be due to a number of causes. So they're not an indicative list of domestic abuse. These can be seen in adults, children, and as I said earlier, everybody's situation is different and everybody is affected differently. But common things that we have seen are self-harm, lack of confidence and low self-esteem, often anxiety as well. PTSD and nightmares are so common. Difficulties in forming those relationships, and this is often picked up in school age with children as well. Unwanted pregnancies, drug and alcohol use, somebody being withdrawn, anger outbursts and destructive behaviour, suicide, and also prostitution, so escorting or getting themselves into what seems like quite provocative behaviour, and often people can't understand why, but there is usually a reason behind that. So we're now going to hear from Maddie around her experiences of domestic abuse and working in the field that she's working in, which is the financial industry. So Maddie, thank you. And firstly, who are you? Can you tell us a little bit about who you are? You just unmute yourself. Perfect.
Fantastic. Yes, no problem. So many of you will know me, but my name's Maddie Forrester. I've worked in the investment industry for over 35 years, which is a bit worrying. Had a ball. Most recently, I've been at MFS now for 10 years, and I look after our global consultant relations team. But I've done a lot of different roles, and also working in the financial industry has allowed me to do things outside. So I can consider myself very fortunate, Emma.
Thank you. So you've obviously volunteered to be on this panel today and share your own experiences of domestic abuse. So what's motivated you to do this?
A few things. I mean, for me personally, the timing is right. I've never kept my experiences a secret, but I have in the last couple of years talked more publicly about them. And the main reason for that now is that my boys, my lovely boys, are 20 plus, and I've got their support, and this is our story. So I didn't want to tell it at a time when they couldn't agree to that. In addition, 20 years gives you some perspective, so it's not quite so raw, which is definitely helpful when you're talking about something so personal. Why would I want to talk about it? You know, like you, I still remember a lot of those things like they were yesterday. And as well as feeling very alone, I felt incredibly embarrassed, you know, and ashamed that this was happening to me, that in the industry, people thought of me, and I was already 10 years plus into my career, people thought of me as strong and capable, and yet I was going home and not being strong and capable, or at least not feeling it. So my hope is by somebody like me talking about this, it will bring to life what you're talking about, which is actually there is no stereotypical survivor, and this does happen to a much broader range of people than people think. And then the last reason is that we'll, I'm sure, get onto it, but I did have help from colleagues and industry friends when I left. And I passionately believe that particularly with this crime, where often for people in the financial sector, they will be allowed to carry on working. They might be the sole breadwinner, or they might be a very important breadwinner. And so sometimes when you've been isolated from friends and family, work is actually the last lifeline. And that's how it was for me. So I think it's important that as an industry, we recognise that and think about how we play our part to support people.
Thank you, Maddie. And I appreciate it's difficult, but can you tell us a little bit about your experiences?
Yeah, I mean, I was definitely vulnerable going into the relationship. I was turning 30. I think it's safe to say my biological clock was beating like a drum, not ticking like a clock. And like you, my ex-husband was very, very charming when he wanted to be. He made me feel safe. He made me feel wanted and happy. I think it's fair to say that the mental abuse, I think what you'd call coercive control, started quite quickly. He kept falling out with my friends and family. And it wasn't that he was aggressive, but he would take offence. So he appeared like the victim in those things. And at the time, I would sympathise, but he would hold a grudge. I mean, he would never forgive even the slightest kind of insult, and therefore I stopped seeing people quite early. He also had very unrealistic expectations, so we moved in together quite quickly, and the most bizarre things became highly charged. We would wash up. He would wash, I would dry. He would want me to dry every plate or cup or spoon in exactly the order that he had washed it, because apparently that was very efficient. I mean, I'm laughing now, but it was just terrifying. So there were all these tasks that I could never complete. And so I was always, like you, in the wrong for really things that were trivial. We had children, we had 2 children together. And that was really where the problem started. So he would kind of undermine my confidence as a mother. I already felt guilty. I'd gone back to work very quickly. And I felt bad about that, and he used that against me, and all these crazy domestic tasks became part of the problem. I was unhygienic, I was not safe, I didn't pay enough attention to safety or to tasks to do with the children, and if it wasn't for him they wouldn't be safe. I mean, it sounds mad, but all of this kind of mental games happened really quite quickly. At the same time, the violence actually escalated really slowly. So before I moved in with him, I never saw any violence. Occasionally, and you know, this now I see it as a red flag, occasionally I would come home and something would be broken. And there'd be a really weird explanation. And I think deep down I knew he was breaking those things, but I couldn't prove it, and I put it out of my mind. Once we got married, we started with him breaking things in front of me, and then pushing and shoving and just generally being rougher than I would have liked. The real violence didn't start until after the birth of our first child. And you mentioned strangulation. Strangulation was one of the things he did. He was a very large man. He was 6'7", and he would pick me up by my throat and lift me off my feet. And obviously you then choke. And he would do that until I was scared, and then he would just drop me. But for me, it didn't make me feel like a victim of, you know, he wasn't hitting me. That's what I would have said to myself at the time. So that's really where we went. The first time that he actually hit me as such in a way that I would have identified. Our second son was 10 days old. I had 2 children in the house. I was living by then somewhere I didn't know anybody, and I wasn't going anywhere. And then towards the end, there were more violent assaults. But it's that combination for me of this fairly quick isolation and controlling and strange objectives, the undermining of my confidence with this slow build up in violence that made me very out of sorts, and I think took away some of my rationality.
Thank you, Maddie, for sharing that. And I'm sorry to hear that you experienced that. Also, thank you for touching on the point around pregnancy, because actually that is a point within an abusive relationship when there is usually an escalation. And that is, again, because that perpetrator loses control over that victim. They're no longer the focus. That unborn baby becomes that focus. So thank you for highlighting that as well. So obviously you were working at the time. So was that difficult? How did you manage that?
Yeah, it was difficult. It was also a blessing. I mean, most of these things are a blessing and a curse. So it was definitely difficult. I mean, I'm somebody who prides myself on working really hard and being very effective and capable. I think it's fair to say when I look back, I don't think I was at my best. I was definitely less reliable. I remember one morning, I was commuting at the time from Norfolk, so I was coming in from Diss, an hour and a half on the train. And I was literally just pulling into the station, and he phoned and said, "You didn't put the blinds down when you put the kids to bed last night, and now they're awake and they're screaming and I can't cope, and it's all your fault, and you need to come home now because I am not going to deal with them." And it's like, so literally I got back on the train and went home and phoned in and said, I'm sick, I've been ill on the train, I'm going back home again. So like you, forced to lie to people who I knew, you know, were depending on me. And then you end up feeling worse, and you withdraw a bit and you pull back from relationships, and people sense that and they pull away from you too. So yes, that was the downside. The upside was I had great colleagues, great friends, and I loved work, and I still love work. So I would go to work on a Monday feeling kind of crazy, ridiculous, like I was no good for anything. And by the time I got to Friday, thank God we weren't working from home then. I mean, at least I got 5 days in the office. Generally, the incidents didn't really tend to happen at night. So by Friday, I'd be feeling quite capable and quite strong. And like, I can do this. I can overcome this. I'd go home, have all that confidence kicked out of me again, and start again. So I look back at that time and think it was a bit of a roller coaster. Maybe I stayed longer because I kept thinking I was okay. But definitely work was more of a positive than a negative for sure.
And in terms of that, like, what support did you need there? And were they able to help you with that?
So I mean, you got to remember we're talking 20 years ago. I never formally disclosed to work. But I had a great colleague, and I also had one really good industry friend. I mean, in general, it's very difficult for people, and I think it's not just those of us who experience domestic abuse who are hurt by it, but definitely those bystanders who don't know or suspect and don't know what to do also suffer. So most people, in my experience, just slightly withdraw. They kind of lean out. I had a small group of friends who and family who leaned in, and one of those was a colleague and one of those was an industry friend. For me, when I eventually left, they were both crucial. So one of them, basically my colleague used his credit card to help me fund some legal advice. And I took cash out bit by bit and paid him back, you know, a little bit every day. And then when I finally did leave, I needed somewhere safe to go. I went at the end of a business trip. I went and collected my kids from the childminder in a hired car. And I went to a friend in the industry who had a second home, and I knew that that home would not be in our address book. And I hadn't wanted to take the address book with me in case it tipped off my husband about my plans. And so she made her home available to me whilst I made the, you know, the next part of that plan, and I stayed there for several days. So that's the sort of help that I hope that we can give, particularly that around making financial help for counselling, for legal help available by giving people advance help to their money, or being prepared to divert some of your own money away. But yeah, that was crucial.
Yeah, so obviously you were working in the financial industry and actually were probably classed as a breadwinner in the family. So was that helpful, or was that actually a hindrance for you?
It was definitely helpful psychologically. You know, I often think about getting that strength to leave, and I consider myself very lucky because I did know, whilst the act of leaving itself was terrifying, I did know that once I left, I had the capability to look after myself and the boys, and to be financially and emotionally secure. So I had that hope, and that's a massive help. So I don't want to put down the real much larger task that some people have in leaving, who have significantly less than we do in our industry. There were some downsides though that I hope are being eradicated, but I suspect will just be replaced with new ones. So because I wasn't deemed to be the primary child provider, I actually had to apply to the courts for permission to leave. One of the reasons I hadn't left is my husband used to say to me, if you ever take my children away from me, I will kill you. And I couldn't be totally sure that wasn't true. He also would kind of talk about, well, I'll report the car stolen, I'll do this, I'll do that. So I knew he would use legal means to prevent me. And so I had sought legal advice. And I had to apply to the courts for permission to take the children, which is a step that other people might not need to go through. And secondly, had one particular kind of difficulty, which was if you apply to the courts and they give you permission, even if you don't leave, they will serve the papers a certain number of weeks afterwards. And so I actually almost left and didn't on one occasion when I realised that if I changed my mind and I didn't do it, those papers would turn up at the door. So that was definitely a problem, being perceived as the kind of non-child carer, even though I knew by then that I was the more capable parent. And the second one was when we got to things like access, where definitely the courts want to appear equal. It quite suits them on occasion to have things that look the other way around. So I won't bore you with the details, but yeah, I didn't find the legal system particularly friendly to what I would class myself, and was by then looking at, you know, a capable and strong woman with good earnings.
Thank you, Maddie. So lastly, obviously you've spoken about really horrific experiences. How has that affected you since?
I'd love to tell you it's a happy, I mean, it is a very happy story, but I'd love to tell you it was instantaneously happy, and that would be untrue. You know, I think bad decisions and bad experiences compound. So I didn't go on and make perfect decisions immediately afterwards. I never got involved with a violent man again. But I didn't. I did carry that baggage around for a while. I also think that it's quite hard, and this probably does apply to our industry, to not have that kind of perfect family. And this is why, to some degree, this is an inclusion issue. And so definitely at times where I've been promoted, definitely at times when I suddenly had far more to do with the US, when I took on my global role, I felt under pressure that I provide quite a messy background story, you know, and have shied away, at least at first, from sharing, you know, the real me, because it all sounds a little bit complicated, even if I just give the basic stats. So that's been a factor. But I would say that I am now in a fantastic place. I do view what happened to me as a blip. Yeah, it was a very difficult time. And there, but the grace of God go I, you know, I got away, I put it right. My kids were young enough that they don't really remember it. And I've had a brilliant life. I mean, I've gone on to have a fantastic career. I've got two beautiful young men as sons, and we are all very close. So, you know, would I swap my life for anybody else's? No. And you don't get to pick and choose. You don't get to say, I don't want that bit, but I'll have all the rest. Because without that experience, I wouldn't be me. I probably wouldn't have some of the compassion that I hope I do have. So I still consider myself very blessed, Emma, despite what was a difficult experience.
Thank you, Maddie. Thank you so much for your transparency, your honesty, and your bravery today as well. We're just going to pause just to see if there's a few questions that I think have come in the chat. So I'm going to hand over to Lindsay and Adriana, who are managing the questions.
Thank you, Emma, and thank you, Maddie. And from the bottom of my heart, thank you both so much for sharing your stories. I did have to go off camera personally because they were quite difficult, but they are needed. I mean, that kind of, we've all got to sit in an uncomfortable place to be able to help other people. So thank you. We have had a couple of questions, and Maddie, the first two, well, there's a few I just directed towards you, if you don't mind.
No, that's fine.
There's a question that has come in that said, do you feel that being the breadwinner was a contributory factor to your husband's abuse?
Yeah, probably I do. It would be dishonest to say I didn't. And I think for two reasons. I think I mean, I'm very conscious of what Emma said, and I don't want to excuse his behaviour. And it's interesting. You provoke me to peel back another layer of the onion, because I tend to tell people that that I am not, that I've forgiven him and that I see him as a victim too, and making me wonder whether I should do that, but I do. But I do think he had a very hard life, and I think I remember after one particular violent episode, he said something along the lines of, I was miserable all my life, and when I met you, I always thought that when I got married, everything would be all right, and when I met you, I thought that was going to be the case, and I'm now so more miserable, and that must be your fault. And I think the money was part of what attracted him to me in the first place. I think he thought that was going to give us, milk and honey, and we were going to have the 2 kids he wanted. And I think it also reminded him, on some level, he felt inadequate, and that was when he got angry. So I think this combination, it's probably part of the attraction, and it was probably part of the difficulty. The upside was he wasn't going to stop me going to work, because it's what kept our lifestyle going, and that gave me that strength. But yes, it was definitely a factor, Lindsay.
It's such an interesting and complex relationship, isn't it? Which you kind of can't, it makes it that bit harder to extract yourself from. We'll touch a little bit on the kind of the mental health side of thing in a moment, but there's kind of an ongoing, well, I guess the question is probably yes, but the follow-on question from that was, did you have a sense of guilt of taking away that financial stability, which may have during the process delayed your decisions to leave because of that kind of symbiotic relationship, perhaps?
Sorry, say that one again.
So given that you were the breadwinner, you were providing the capital into the household, and that created this kind of dynamic between the two of you, do you think that by removing yourself, and therefore removing the financial stability for him, was kind of created guilt in you that delayed your exit?
I don't know. I don't think so. I mean, that question, why, and I'm going to answer it, because I know that Emma says we shouldn't ask for why, we shouldn't think why do people not leave. But I think let me answer that first, Lindsay, if you don't mind, and then I'll answer why didn't I leave. At first I didn't leave because I thought I could make it all better, very much picking up on the Emma situation. And then by the time I'd got over that, I didn't leave because I was too terrified to do so. And so actually, it's not that I didn't think that, but I didn't think that because I was too busy thinking one of the first former ones. And to be fair, without being too personal, I ended up paying him quite a big check. So I don't think he was financially unstable, particularly given that I took responsibility for bringing up the kids. So no, it's not one that keeps me awake at night, no. And I don't honestly think that was part of the problem. Maybe if we had been more on the breadline, maybe if I'd been 2 or 3 years into my career, that might have been more of a problem. So I don't know. It's such a personal set of circumstances. I can see that it might be a problem for somebody else, definitely.
We've had another question related to, you talk about the kind of fear factor. Were you concerned about your ex-husband having access to your sons?
That's a really difficult one. Definitely when I was there, I was not concerned at all about the safety of my sons, probably falsely and foolishly. But he presented himself, part of his power over me was that a bit similar to Emma, where she was talking about her ex saying, but I love you so much. One of his things was, I love the kids so much. I'm such a great dad. And definitely in front of me, he always appeared that way. So it never crossed my mind that he was a danger to the children when we were there, to such an extent that, so when I left, what triggered me leaving was him attacking me in front of the children. And at that point, it became totally clear to me that I wasn't staying because he was a great dad. I was staying because I was just too bloody scared to go. And we went, and I absolutely stand by that decision, they would have become victims as soon as they became witnesses to what was going on. So I was a bit scarred by that when I left. When I came back, I had a very good solicitor who said, you know, the trouble is if you stop him seeing the children, then that makes it harder when they pick it back up. So I did give him access to the children right from as soon as the necessary safety for me was in place. So as soon as I had a non-molestation order and he had to stay away. But I told him that his sister had to be there. So he went to him and his sisters for days until we went, you know, during the day, until we went to court. It is worth knowing, though, that that was one of the things the court said to me when I went, which was, well, you obviously aren't that scared because you've given him access already. So I'm not sure I would give everybody else the same advice. But I did that thinking it was the same thing. He got quite generous access twice a week, one overnight, one separate day. He kept that up for about 3 months, and then he decided not to see them again. And that has been hugely, hugely painful for them, massively. And they carry that with them, I think, every day. It's probably been easier for me than had he stayed involved, if I'm being brutally honest. But it's not the outcome I would have wanted. It has taken some of that concern away. And knowing what I now know and having peeled back the onion more, I think that it would have been very difficult for me to continue to leave them with him without those fears, but I didn't have to go through that. Sorry, that was a really long answer to a
No, that I think it will. It's a complex question, and I think the points that you touch on demonstrate the layers and layers of impact that these situations have on families. Obviously your children will kind of, as you say, bear that for the rest of their lives. There is a question just on related to families, which actually can go to really both of you, but it was an open question kind of saying, if you think that your families knew more about the abuse, do you think they would have intervened on your behalf? I don't know. Emma, do you want to comment on that?
So I think my family did know, but they didn't know how to approach it. And every time they tried to say something, I jumped to defend him, because when you're in that abusive situation and it's that paralyzing, you do anything you can to keep yourself safe and alive. And for me, it was push everyone else away and keep him happy. So I became his protector. But they definitely knew. They just didn't know how to help me.
Devastating. Maddie?
That's a really difficult one. I'm not sure my family did know, possibly because I was that bit older. I was the oldest sister of 4. I had this, you know, at that point in our careers, 5 years or 10 years, you know, that makes quite a big difference to where you are and how you look to other people. So I don't know whether they did know. I do know, though, that I sensed the vast majority of people, as I say, pulling away. And I think I wasn't quite where Emma was. So and this is where 20 years probably isn't useful. I can't be 100% sure. My recollection now is that if people, and there were, you know, 2 or 3 people who asked me in the right way, is he hitting you? That I always said yes. But that was not somebody who just went in on day one and said, well, he's not being violent, is he? In which case I'd say no. This was somebody who might have met with me once a month for 6 months and just gently pushed on that subject. And when they saw me looking particularly distraught, asked that question. And my recollection is that I said yes. So I think my family would have acted had they known. But I think it's very difficult for people to know unless they're engaging in a quite purposeful way.
As suspected, we're now getting a barrage of questions. Just
Lindsay, it's worth saying, if we don't get to them all and anybody does have something they really want to ask me, I'm on LinkedIn and they can
We will,
message me. So.
and some of them will bring in Amit as well, because they're much more about employers. That I just want to kind of round off one of the questions that you've already touched on to some extent, which was around, you obviously mentioned you had a colleague and an industry friend who kind of helped to kind of get you out of that situation and identified the issue. What was it? How did they pick it up? Is this what you were just referring to, that it was just the odd kind of question every now and again enough to allow them to what works? What were the right questions that were being asked?
So it was that kind of gentle, non-judgmental probing. Are you okay? You don't seem okay. Is there anything I can do to help? And then I'd listen and they'd go, yeah, that must be hard. That must be really hard. And not necessarily jump in to solve, which then meant when I spoke to them, a week later or a month later, they could say, how are things? Are things better? And sometimes I'd say, yeah, they are, because there could be periods of time when things were better. But that established the circle of trust, that they weren't immediately leaping on things. And then once they knew more about the situation, they were able to reflect back to me that things were getting worse. And that was quite important, because the danger is that these things, it's a bit like the boiled frog analogy. The frog can jump out of boiling water, but it doesn't, because the temperature increases so gradually. And whilst there were shocks to the system, you're already in that water, and it's difficult to find a line. I found a line in the end. And what friends can do is help reflect back to you that things are getting worse, and talk to you about, well, you do know that if something did happen, what are you going to do? How are you going to get out of that? And that enabled me to kind of start imagining routes and working out what didn't work and what did. And so that kind of, let's talk about it conceptually, once you've built up trust, can be quite useful, I think.
Okay, great. I'm just going to ask one last question to the two of you, and then Emma, I'm just going to pass back to you, because then we'll bring in Amit to try and kind of explore it more in terms of kind of how employers can set themselves up to be able to support. Hopefully there won't be, but obviously support any kind of future victims. A question was, if you suspected one of your family members was experiencing any domestic abuse, what would you now do based on your own experiences? I mean, Emma, you probably got, your wealth of experience of all the kind of people that you've worked with through the refuge. I don't know if you want to comment on that one.
Yeah, so it's just around, be patient, be led by them. So hear their voice and what is being said to you, trust them and put that trust in them, that they are capable of keeping themselves safe and making the changes they need to make, but it needs to be in their time. No judgmental comments around why didn't you just leave or why did you stay. It's just about kind of hand holding, showing that support. Don't offer to be a mediator or someone that can fix and solve everything. Yes, there's practical things that you can do to help, but again, as I said earlier, you as the survivor know your own risks. And if someone is saying to you, that's not safe for me to leave because I'll be killed, you have to follow that. So don't be forceful, just be led by them. Victims have had their voice taken away from them for so long. And what we don't want to do is silence them further if they start to reach out for support. So it's just around showing that caring, empathetic approach. But I think when we next go to our panel, we can touch on how difficult that might be from an employee's point of view as well, and an employer's point of view.
Wonderful, thanks. Okay, Emma, I'll let you carry on.
Perfect. Thank you, Lindsay. Thank you, Madeline. So I'm mindful of time, and I know that we're probably going to have lots of questions after the next panel discussion as well. So the slides are being sent out. So I'm very quickly just going to skim through them. And if there's any further questions, as Adriana's already said, please signpost them to her. And then myself, Maddie, Lindsay, Amit can all answer these after the event. So domestic abuse in the workplace. So preventing and tackling it is obviously incredibly important. And that's around providing a safe and effective work environment. So what can you do as an employer? So acknowledge it. Understand the issues like you are today, learn more about domestic abuse. So take a proactive role in learning more, respond. So look at your training. Have your staff had training? Do you have a policy in place? Do you have somebody that's assigned to domestic abuse, so that there is somebody safe for someone to reach out to should they need it? And refer. So don't be afraid if you don't have all the answers. I've worked in this field for 10 years and I still don't know all the answers. Things are changing all the time. So just educate yourself around where can you signpost people to if they need that help. And when these slides come out, on the very last slide, there is a number of resources I've put in there where you can signpost to. Next slide, please. So understanding the abuse, so being aware and proactive is important, but we recognise, and you've heard today, it's not always easy to detect when somebody's in an abusive situation, and it's difficult to ask those questions, especially if you don't know how to ask them or what to do with that information when it's shared. When we looked at the effects earlier, we know that obviously some indicators will point to it being an abusive situation, but also there could be other illnesses or something else going on in that person's life that isn't linked to domestic abuse. So it's good to be mindful of that too. So what we're hoping for is that a proactive employer would look out for these issues, but more so as a general blanket than an actual indicator. The more supportive atmosphere that you can create, the better, because if there's a safe environment where people feel that they can share their experiences and get the help they need, they're more likely to open up about their difficult experiences. So with our last slide, we're just very quickly, if you don't mind, next slide please, going to look at potentially some of the changes that you might see in the work environment. So the summary down the side is around work productivity. So that's like a change in the person's working pattern. So they might all of a sudden be coming to work late, or they might need to leave work early. They might go off sick a lot. You might see that they have reduced their quality and quantity of work. So they're missing deadlines. They're not their usual selves. Spending increased hours at work for no reason. So appearing like they don't want to go home. Visiting. So you might find that that perpetrator turns up at the workplace all the time. And this was something my ex did. He used to turn up to make sure I wasn't talking to any men. So unknown to me, he'd be waiting outside my work when I left. Changes in behaviour, and someone's character as well. So if they seem different, if they appear different, don't be afraid to ask those questions. Are you okay? Is there anything going on at home? Is there anything I can help with? Is there anything you want to talk about? They might be quiet, anxious, tearful. They might become aggressive. You might see that they're depressed. If they start to isolate themselves from colleagues, so they might not come to social events. I never went to any social events. It was not worth the hassle that I would have to deal with if I went to work social events. They might become secretive about their home life, and also they might appear to be worried about leaving their children at home. There may be physical indicators, which I think could be the most obvious one. So there could be visible bruising, which is what people often look out for. You might see that they're now wearing long sleeves, even though it's summer. It might be that they are coming into work smelling of alcohol, or you have concerns around drug use. And then other indicators such as stalking and harassment, as we touched on earlier, but that could be around someone's social media. So for me, my ex's mum posted a picture of my ex's grave and all my details. So my full name, my contact number, my address, saying where I lived, and labelled me as his murderer. And isolating from family and I appreciate that was very quick and we've just skimmed over that, but we will look to provide further information around that later should people need it. So just before we go to our last slide around hearing from another survivor in the industry, we're going to go to our last panel. So we're going to open up the panel to Amit and Lindsay to hear about mental health and also working in HR. So Amit, thank you for joining us today. Why is it important for companies to address domestic abuse?
Firstly, thank you for having me, and thank you for sharing your experience both to Maddie and Emma. I feel that whatever we've heard through this panel, it's very obvious that companies do need to recognize that any of its employees may experience domestic violence, and this can have a significant impact on them at work. So we're not even talking outside work. So surviving and experiencing violence can affect an employee's ability to focus and engage properly with their work. A perpetrator of abuse, as you've mentioned, can seek to interfere with the employee's career prospects. or ability to work. You gave a wonderful example of like someone actually coming into work and trying to interfere in the relationship they have with their colleagues. And this is a great example of where violence actually takes place within the workplace. So there's definitely a role for the companies to create a more safer and supportive working environment. It's not something that's happening outside. It's happening to employees who are within the workplace.
Thank you, Amit. But some people may think, oh, it's a private issue. It's not something we should intrude in. What's your take on that?
Yes, I've heard that before, and I feel a work-based response is key. So we need to understand, and this was mentioned in one of your slides as well, that people are more likely to disclose to someone who's around them. And this obviously includes their managers, their colleagues. And let's also not forget that workplaces do feel like safer spaces for disclosure, because a workplace may be someone's only opportunity without surveillance and monitoring to actually reach out for help. So we shouldn't close that door. Now, having said that, we know the role of the companies there. I think it's very important that with whatever support that companies provide, the survivor is at the center of it. This means
Amit has paused, so I'm just going to jump to Lindsay to bring her in around a mental health perspective, and then we will come back to Amit shortly. So Lindsay, thinking about kind of mental health, how can tackling a mental health perspective support victims of domestic abuse, like within the workplace setting?
So I think the one thing that's clear from the kind of conversations, your slides, is that the manifestation of the symptoms, if you like, symptoms feels like the wrong word because symptoms feels like you got a medical complaint, but the kind of effects on people of domestic violence situations can be so varied, and it can really impact people's health and well-being. Amit, we're just moving on to mental health while you reconnect to the internet. So briefly, just to comment from that angle is what I think, therefore, and I think Maddie has certainly talked about, and you have, Emma, about what is needed is that recognition of what is going on in people's backgrounds, this understanding that we all have kind of challenges in our lives, and we really need to be able to take the time as colleagues, as line managers, as employers, no matter what kind of part of the ecosystem within a workplace you are, it's all on us to create an inclusive environment. It's not just up to, HR. That this is about being able to kind of take time to ask questions, ask genuinely, how are you? Not on an overly persistent basis to kind of create tension in that relationship, but in a way that I think certainly Maddie was able to articulate with those kind of relationships where they were like, are you okay? And let me just kind of replay that back to you. Certainly as a mental health first aider, we talk very much about just asking questions, non-judgmental listening. And again, that's not like, oh God, that's awful. Right, let's go and fix this. Let's sort this all out. That's not the approach. It's that must be very difficult for you. And you replay back to someone because that can help them recognize something that maybe they didn't realize. And the most important thing is obviously then kind of signposting to support services. And I think that's probably, I was going to say a great time to go back to Amit, who's either fallen asleep while I'm speaking or has lost his internet again. But yeah, so I think, it's the fundamental kind of basic steps around being a mental health first aider, which is trying to recognize, and you've very helpfully given a huge range of various signs and symptoms that could be an indication of domestic violence going on. They could also be signs that someone's having mental health challenges. They could be signs and symptoms of something else going on in their lives. But we have to, as colleagues, employees, employers, recognize that people have stuff going on in their lives, and let's try to create an environment where we can have constructive conversations around that.
Thank you, Lindsay, for that really insightful insight into the mental health field, which is obviously a very complex one as well. So Amit, coming back to you, what can companies do to support domestic abuse survivors?
Yes, and I hope my internet doesn't go away. So It's perhaps best to share the framework that AXA has launched globally towards the end of last year. So we've made a commitment to support every employee experiencing domestic abuse through a range of measures. And this includes a trusted contact to provide support and also to signpost to our employee assistance program and other external specialist support services like the one you run, Emma. And we have also committed increased flexibility and security at work. This includes paid time off across all our geographies. And flexibility can include many things. It can be a temporary or a permanent change of workplace, working times or patterns. It could simply mean flexibility for the survivor to facilitate any practical arrangements. And when it comes to security, there are again a lot of things a company can do. It could mean changing the bank details, emails, emergency contacts, or measures to stop the perpetrator from accessing the survivor. I think within all this, training is critical, not only for any trusted contact, but also for the broader organization. Unfortunately, in a lot of companies, domestic abuse is still a taboo topic. So more training and awareness can be helpful. Emma's organization, I Choose Freedom, provides training. And if you use organizations and charities like that, you're actually also contributing to supporting the communities. Employee resource groups do play a very important role. Especially this is a transversal subject where various employee resource groups can come together and support this area. And what I do want to highlight is that every situation is different. So it's always worth asking the survivor, what do they need in terms of support? And also what's important, just to set the expectations, is that the impact of domestic abuse is generally long-term. Therefore, the support is likely to be ongoing and can change based on how the survivor's personal circumstances evolve. A lot of companies need a fix-it solution. This is probably a situation where you would have to keep in touch and ensure that relevant support is provided as the circumstances evolve.
Thank you, Amit. I'm mindful we've only got 5 minutes left, so I think what's good to do is us to jump back to any kind of pressing questions, and then what we'll do obviously in our follow-up notes is send out some further information from Amit around the services that AXA provide. I will send out some further information around the charity that I run, in case people want to get involved and learn more about us. But yeah, I think, Lindsay, if we go back to any final questions, or if not, we will just wrap it up. The last slide that you'll see on there is a survivor's voice, and it's some practical tips that really helped her, and that is somebody who works in the financial industry. We haven't got time to go through it today, but again, they will come out in the slides, so hopefully they'll be useful too. But let me hand back to you, Lindsay.
Thank you. A couple of questions, couple which will be really quick, I think. Well, I hope. Somebody's asked, they said, I think there's either a word or a phrase that if someone was to use, it was to mean that they're in danger and they need help.
Yeah, so it's Ask Annie is what was used during COVID.
Oh, Ask Annie. See, I thought it was Ask Angela. That the pubs use Ask Angela. Is it both?
Couple. Yeah, there's a few, but it's if you just pop it into the internet, they'll bring up various variations of it.
Ask Annie, Ask Angela, as long as there's no Annie or Angela working in the workplace to really confuse situations. But obviously that's when usually in a setting at which you are surrounded by the perpetrator as well. So it's a kind of desensitized reference point. So we've just been talking a little bit about kind of what can the employer do and what policies, what kind of systems and what support mechanisms can be created. I guess on the flip side, we've had a kind of question that just said, well, I wish, I wish I'd approached it better with my employer when I went through this. So if you had one piece of advice on how to engage as a victim with the workplace better, what would it be? Emma, both Emma and Amit, I think you can probably comment on that perhaps.
Yeah.
Or...
I think personally for me, it would just be transparent as you feel comfortable in being, because people can't help you if they don't know what you're going through.
Yes, I think what's important is, and when someone's in the middle of this abuse, it's very hard. It's to realize that they are not to blame, that it's something that's happening to them. They are a victim, and that would help them to be more open about it in disclosing that.
Okay. There was one other question, which I don't know, Emma, if you know the answer to. It was a question directed to Maddie, but it was just, and I don't know if you know the answer either, which was just a very detailed question around the court order requirement. If you want to take children, you had to get a court order to be able to remove your children from the situation. But is that only for very young children? Is it up to 16 or 18? Do you happen, does anyone happen to know that limit?
So I'm not going to say that I know fully the legal stuff on that. I can recommend a solicitor's firm who would. In our case, it depends on parental rights and things like that. So if a perpetrator is on the birth certificate, then we hit more difficulties with our families. And for us, them going through contact with their children is always a way of relocating where that family has gone. So it's another way of controlling that victim. We are in the process of setting up a court pack. We run training for judges, courts, lawyers, and we're in the process of setting up a court pack for survivors that will be available to purchase to navigate them through the court system. But if that question can remain in the chat, I can find out and then feed that back.
Yeah, and I don't know, and I don't even know whether that's still a requirement. So that was just part of my story. I would suggest that, you know, I mean, my kids were 2 and 4 at the time, so they couldn't comment. And that's why I was so careful given the run up to everything. I think if your children were older and were prepared to say, no, I haven't been, you know, stolen away, it would get easier. So we'd need, again, I don't know the law, but I think in my case, it was definitely not helped by the fact the children were so young.
What I think is inevitable is that you know, often with legal cases, it does always depend, and there will be nuances, and you know, it unfortunately gets battled out in the courts one way or the other, unfortunately, which just adds to the trauma that everybody experiences. Emma, I was just going to very, very briefly for 20 seconds just run through some of the other final points that I wanted to, and then I'll wrap up and close if that's, do you mind, if that's okay? So we have talked about, I mean, we've covered so much. We were worried beforehand if we had far too much to cover. The answer is yes, probably yes. But I suppose what we wanted to try and do is try and address, like, this is a huge issue. This affects huge numbers of people. What can we do? The answer is it really depends, and it is so difficult, but let's at least try to create cultures, workplaces that are supportive of each other, no matter what might be going on in their backgrounds, that we can create a culture as organizations that is supportive and respectful of people. I think, you know, the way in which we demonstrate as organizations how to behave with one another. Also, because I think what we need to recognize, as I think was briefly touched on, perpetrators can also be our colleagues. So we need to be able to create working cultures that are respectful of every gender, respectful of every type of individual, no matter what their background, that it's not okay to kind of discriminate others, use kind of abuses of power in any situation whatsoever, that we do create an environment where we recognize the importance of mental well-being, that we allow safe spaces to exist at work. And also we have huge amounts where possible of training to be able to support our line managers who are already overwhelmed with their day job about, again, being able to have those kind of supportive conversations with all of their colleagues. We understand we're kind of asking a lot. And I guess the other point, just from a mental health perspective, is, as I think's been touched on, the ongoing impact of these traumatic situations on families is huge. And we can never get it right, and we can never know exactly what's going on. But as long as we are recognizing without judgment that people kind of have all sorts going on in their lives, then I think we can create a good environment alongside all these wonderful policies that AXA and others are putting in place. So hopefully that's been a few guiding tips. I thank you so much to Emma. Thank you so much to Maddie for being exceptionally brave and giving your personal experiences. We have noted